Tactile meanings are the meanings involved in bodily sensation. Our definition includes the closely connected bodily sensations of touch, of taste and smell. We're able to feel temperature, pressure, texture and pain through the sense of touch. We're able to distinguish bitter, sweet, sour, salty and savoury through our senses of taste. We can distinguish between solids and liquid substances. However, our primary organ of taste, the tongue, can also feel in a touch-like way. It can feel temperature, texture, and if something is chilly hot. Meanwhile, our sense of smell can detect chemical differences between gaseous substances through hundreds of meaning distinctions, many, many more than taste. So when we eat and drink, taste, smell and touch are all integrated in complex, overlaid ways.
Now I'm going on to the next one of our modes, which is what we call tactile meanings. And tactile meanings happen through our senses of touch and taste and smell. So, and our tactile meanings are meanings whose designs are represented and communicated via touch, taste and smell. So what we have in the world is, let's go back to the cafe that we saw when we were looking at spatial meanings, that we might have a cup there, and on the cup might be the logo of the shop, or it might say something about the cafe. It might say something about the cafe if it's a paper cup as opposed to a beautifully made porcelain cup, for example. So in other words, what we do is we have this object, which is the cup. I have another object, which is my laptop, which I brought in. I have another object, which might be a book. And don't forget, a book is an object, right? So what we do is we, in life, we enact our meaning through sequences of action which involve objects, which involve things. And in fact, the very first meanings that we make as human beings, as babies when we're born, before we get into language, and actually probably, to what extent is it before or simultaneous with gaining vision? It's simultaneous with gaining vision, actually, but it's certainly before you speak, and certainly way before you write, that what we do is that we have physical objects that we touch, a ball, something that a young baby puts in its mouth, and so on. So in other words, these are things where in fact what young human beings learn is they learn agency. I pick up the ball and I drop it, and I have affected the world. I'm an actor in the world, and the world can be impacted and influenced by things that I do, but these are objects with which I make meaning, right? As the child gets a little bit beyond being a baby, they have toys, and those toys represent things in all sorts of ways. It might be a doll or a car. It might be just a stick, which I imagine to be an aeroplane, right? So in other words, these things are ways in which I make meaning and I represent the world. This doll is not a person. This car is not literally a car, but it represents all the cars in the world, and it's something, it refers to the world of cars or dolls or whatever. And interestingly, to take a new media example now, that one of the most interesting phenomena is we have these tablets devices, these digital devices now, which are, being a tablet. I mean, the very first tablets in human history were, pieces of clay where, in cuneiform, in the ancient Middle East, people did the first characters by putting these patterns in the first language, the first written language, by putting these characters in tablets. That's where the word comes from originally, something that's written in clay or written in stone. Now, we have these tablets which are essentially versions of e-books. They're essentially digital books in some senses, carrying that lineage through from the very first tablets. However, that in these digital devices, young children pick them up and use them before they can speak and before they can read, certainly before they can read, and they do all this swiping stuff, which is all this stuff which is essentially touch. There are different motions you can do on a tablet, and what you're doing is you're directing the meanings that are happening on the screen via senses of touch. So what's very, very interesting is the reason, I think, why they're so successful with very young children, and actually very good learning devices for very young children as well, is because they appeal to this very, very I won't say primitive, that's being too judgmental, but this original mode of meaning as tactile meaning. I'm going to give just a couple of examples now. Here's an example of very imaginative children. This is an example of children who are building a car out of boxes and bits and pieces and dolls and whatever. And in a way, what we can often do with toys or what children do with toys is they can either do things which are literally iconic representations, the toy car versus the real car, or they can do things which are very, very abstract, where a matchbox, a little box, becomes an imaginary car. So in other words, they're all forms of representation, from literal concrete representations which are iconic through to abstract symbolic representations which very, very young children do using objects. Now, this is an example that I really like, of very, very young children building some dolls in Soweto in South Africa. So this is from the work of Pippa Stein and Denise Newfield. This is a photograph from their work. And these were very, very tiny children in Soweto, which is a poor township on the edge of Johannesburg. A very famous poor township. This is where Nelson Mandela was for a period of time. So anyhow, what they're doing is they're doing stories about queens and fairies and whatever, and to support those stories, they're building these dolls, and they're building these incredibly beautiful dolls, essentially using found objects, bits of bubble wrap, bits of plastic, bits of stuff that don't cost anything, and they're building these representations of narrative, and they're doing that as very, very young children. This is a beautiful example of multimodal learning. The teacher's reading them a story, and they're building these very, very tactile objects, these representations of what they're hearing in the story the teacher's reading them.